March 9, 1945. The city of Tokyo slept beneath a sky that would soon become its enemy. The hour was past midnight, the streets empty, a chill wind brushing across wooden eaves and paper walls. Somewhere in the eastern district of Shitamachi, a mother stirred from sleep, her infant pressed to her chest. She thought she heard a faraway drone, a low vibration in the air that didn't belong to the night. Her husband whispered that it was thunder. It wasn't. It was the sound of America's B-29 bombers coming in from the Pacific, more than 300 of them, gliding through clouds under the command of General Curtis LeMay. Above the city, the black ocean of sky flickered faintly, then glowed orange as the first bombs dropped. For years, Japanese propaganda had mocked American aircraft. The B-29 was called the slow giant, an overbuilt toy too heavy to hit targets with accuracy. Newspapers boasted that the imperial defenses would tear such clumsy machines apart before they even reached the mainland. Tokyo's wooden labyrinth, they said, could never burn all at once. It was too vast, too wet, too alive. But as the first wave of superfortresses opened their bomb bay doors, the insult turned to irony. What fell from the sky that night wasn't high explosive, it was fire itself. The air raid sirens began late, long after the first incendiary clusters had already hit the rooftops. The shrill cry of warning mixed with the growing roar of engines and the soft hiss of napalm. The bombs, small cylinders known as M69s, split open in midair, releasing jellied gasoline that splattered across tiles, tatami, and timber. Within seconds, fire spread faster than thought. The air seemed to catch flame before people could scream. In one district, a row of homes ignited so quickly that it looked as if a crimson wave was rolling down the street. From above, the American crews saw it differently. At 5,000 feet, the cockpit windows glowed red as if the dawn had come early. Navigator Sergeant William Parker later wrote that the heat shimmered through the glass, even at that altitude. Pilots flew with masks on, sweat pooling beneath their helmets. They toggled switches by rote, not realizing that the city below was turning into a single furnace. When they dropped the next wave, the turbulence from rising hot air buffeted their aircraft like a storm. One gunner said it felt like flying through the breath of a dragon. Down below, reality was breaking apart. Entire neighborhoods vanished in minutes. Wooden beams snapped and whirled through the air like torches. The fire made its own weather, pulling oxygen inward and sending 200-mile-per-hour gusts spiraling upward in towering columns of flame. These were fire tornadoes, an inferno that lifted people off their feet, tore roofs from homes, and hurled them into the blaze. The temperature in some alleys reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt melted, rivers boiled, and people who tried to flee toward the canals were swallowed by boiling water. An eyewitness named Toyofumi Ogura wrote in his diary that the air itself screamed. He described how people ran until their clothes caught fire, how mothers shielded babies with their own bodies only to collapse in silence. "We could no longer tell night from day," he wrote. The sky burned brighter than the sun. From the American bases on Guam and Saipan, crews returning home would later say they could see the glow of Tokyo from more than 150 miles away. In Washington, news of the raid filtered in through coded reports. Commanders read figures without emotion. Tonnage dropped, planes lost, estimated damage. But those numbers couldn't capture what the fire had done. Within a few hours, nearly 16 square miles of Tokyo were gone. 100,000 civilians lay dead. Men, women, children. More than died at Hiroshima 5 months later. The imperial capital had been turned into a wasteland of black ash and twisted iron. For Japan's leadership, the humiliation was beyond comprehension. For years they had believed in the invincibility of the home islands. The Americans had been portrayed as soft, mechanical warriors who relied on machines instead of spirit. Yet here was the proof that industry could be more merciless than any sword. The firebombing shattered not just homes but the myth of divine protection. Emperor Hirohito's aides reported that when he saw photographs of Tokyo after the attack, he remained silent for several minutes before quietly asking, "Is this truly our capital?" Meanwhile, on Guam, General Curtis LeMay studied aerial photographs of the devastation. He was a man known for his cold efficiency, not cruelty. He had argued that destroying Japan's industrial base would end the war sooner, sparing millions of future deaths. But even he couldn't ignore what his strategy had unleashed. When asked how he felt about burning a city of civilians, LeMay replied flatly, "If we lose, we'll be tried as war criminals." Then he turned back to his maps, already planning the next mission. The irony of that night went beyond military success. America's bombers, once doubted, now seemed unstoppable. The same aircraft that had failed to hit targets months before were now rewriting the laws of warfare. Yet beneath that triumph lay something darker. A moral line crossed, a threshold humanity had never dared to step over before. In destroying Tokyo's war industries, the United States had discovered a weapon that could annihilate entire cities without a single nuclear charge. The sounds of that night would haunt both nations. Survivors spoke of the strange silence that followed the storm. The crackle of flames gave way to the hiss of cooling metal, the occasional moan of a beam collapsing. The smell, burned oil, wet ash, human flesh, hung over the ruins for weeks. There were no birds, no wind, just heat rising from the ground. Somewhere, the same mother who had woken to the sound of engines searched through the rubble for her child, clutching a melted lunchbox she thought she recognized. To American airmen, the mission was a success beyond expectation. To Japanese civilians, it was the end of the world. Both were right. The firebombing of Tokyo marked a turning point not only in the Pacific War but in the very nature of warfare itself. No city had ever suffered destruction on such a scale in a single night. It was as if technology had finally caught up with the darkest corners of human imagination. From ridicule to ruin, from mockery to horror, the arc of that night told a story larger than any nation. The B-29s had proven their worth, but the cost was something no victory parade could redeem. Even among the American crews, few spoke of it afterward. The silence that followed was heavy, as if history itself refused to breathe. When dawn finally broke over Tokyo, smoke still veiled the sun. The once bright capital lay beneath a gray haze that stretched to the horizon. Columns of survivors walked aimlessly through the ashes, faces streaked with soot, carrying what little the fire had spared. Somewhere, a temple bell rang faintly through the smoke, its tone warped by the heat. It was not a call to prayer. It was the sound of a city mourning itself. What began as a test of military efficiency had become something else entirely. A moment that blurred the line between strategy and suffering. The Americans had sought to end a war quickly, but the fire they unleashed would burn in memory long after the last embers cooled. It was the night the sky itself became a weapon, and Japan learned that even the strongest spirit could be consumed by flame. They called it the Night of the Black Wind. Survivors said the air was so hot it carried the scent of iron and salt, as if the ocean itself had caught fire. In the decades to come, historians would call it the single deadliest air raid in history. But to those who lived it, it was something simpler and more terrible, the night the world stopped being human for a few hours. They called them giants that couldn't touch Tokyo. They were wrong. The night sky turned into a sea of liquid fire. This wasn't war anymore. It was judgment from the heavens. Before March 1945, the American campaign against Japan was faltering. The mighty Boeing B-29 Superfortress had been designed as the ultimate long-range bomber, pressurized, powerful, and expensive, but over the Japanese home islands it was proving almost useless. The high-altitude jet stream over Honshu, reaching 200 miles per hour, scattered bomb patterns miles off target. Crews flying at 30,000 feet could barely see through clouds. Every mission consumed precious fuel from distant island bases and returned with little to show. Analysts in Washington began to question whether the billion-dollar Superfortress program had been a mistake. Newspapers in Tokyo mocked it as the blind giant that drops its bombs into the sea. For American crews, each sortie felt like gambling their lives for a handful of broken roofs. Then, into that frustration stepped a short, square-shouldered officer named General Curtis LeMay. At 38, he already had a reputation for ice-cold precision, an engineer's brain trapped inside a bulldog's body. He had studied the B-29's performance data obsessively and saw what others missed. The The problem wasn't the airplane, he argued, it was the way they were using it. LeMay believed that Japan's real vulnerability was its architecture. 90% of Tokyo's buildings were wood, bamboo, and paper. Japan's war production wasn't confined to huge factories. It was scattered in thousands of neighborhood workshops producing aircraft parts, shells, and uniforms. To destroy Japan's war machine, he said, you burn the cities that feed it. His proposal shocked his peers. He wanted the bombers stripped of guns and armor to lighten them. He wanted them to fly low, 5,000 to 7,000 feet, at night in tight formations without escort. He wanted them to carry not high explosives but incendiary clusters, each packed with dozens of small napalm bombs. Fire will do what precision cannot, he told his staff. When subordinates warned that low-altitude flying over Japan would slaughter his aircrews, LeMay simply replied, we're here to win a war, not to prove we're brave. The weapon that made this vision possible was the M69 incendiary, a 6-pound cylinder filled with jellied gasoline and ignited by a small explosive charge. When released from altitude, hundreds of these canisters scattered in a wide pattern. On impact, each one burst, splashing burning jelly that stuck to anything it touched, wood, skin, cloth, and burned at over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Tests at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah had already demonstrated their effectiveness. American engineers built full-scale mock-ups of Japanese city blocks to see how quickly they'd burn. The answer was terrifyingly fast. Within minutes, entire rows of buildings were gone, the air shimmering with heat. LeMay's plan met immediate resistance from senior officers. General Arnold, chief of the Army Air Forces, hesitated. Even within LeMay's command, many pilots called it suicide. They had trained for high-altitude precision, not for night runs barely above the rooftops. But LeMay was relentless. We've tried their way, he said. Now we'll try mine. On March 6, 1945, he ordered his first experimental low-level strike against the city of Nagoya. The result was chaos. Winds shifted. Anti-aircraft guns shredded formations. Many crews misjudged altitude and nearly collided in the dark. One squadron reported flames so intense that instruments overheated. Dozens of bombers limped home, some ditching in the sea. Crews cursed LeMay's name. But the data told a different story. Despite losses, the bombing density was 5 times higher than previous raids. Fires merged faster and wider. The strategy worked. LeMay was convinced, and he had his proof. 2 nights later, he chose Tokyo as the next target. It wasn't just the capital. It was the industrial heart, producing 50% of Japan's war goods. At Guam, on the afternoon of March 9th, LeMay addressed his crews bluntly. There was no patriotic flourish, no talk of glory. He simply said, you will be bombing Tokyo tonight. You will fly low 5,000 to 7,000 feet. You will carry incendiaries. Make your run and don't waste time. Good luck. The men saluted and dispersed, uneasy but obedient. They removed most defensive guns except for tail turrets. The bombers now carried almost 7 tons of incendiaries each. When darkness fell, 334 B-29s took off from the Marianas. Pilots felt the weight of their cargo, the smell of fuel thick in their nostrils. Inside the planes, the temperature soared, engines droning like thunder. As they approached Japan, LeMay's gamble unfolded. Japanese radar failed to detect them in time. Searchlights swept empty skies while the formation slipped in under the clouds. At 12:08 a.m., the lead bomber dropped the first magnesium markers over Tokyo's eastern districts. Within seconds, the landscape below became a pattern of orange flares. Each following plane lined up by those lights, releasing its load in precise intervals. One crewman later wrote that it looked like Christmas lights spread over the earth until they began to move. The fires joined, multiplied, then devoured everything. From the ground, people saw the sky bloom in red petals. The first bombs fell silently. Then came the rush of wind, the explosion of burning jelly splattering across rooftops. Children woke to walls already glowing. Streets filled with smoke so thick it turned to darkness again. The heat drove people into canals, but the water boiled around them. In less than an hour, central Tokyo was unrecognizable. Pilots reported turbulence so violent that planes bucked as if caught in an ocean storm. The heat columns lifted debris thousands of feet high, roof tiles, furniture, human bodies. One gunner said he saw sparks swirling like fireflies, then realized they were burning houses rising into the air. LeMay, monitoring the mission from Guam, received a steady stream of coded reports. Fire visible from coast to coast. One transmission read. Another reported that the glow could be seen 100 miles away. On radar, the city's reflection vanished. There was nothing left solid enough to bounce a signal. By morning, Tokyo's map looked like a blank space. When crews returned, the airfield filled with exhausted men. Some could barely walk after 10-hour flights. Yet the mission had achieved everything LeMay predicted. Only 14 aircraft were lost. In exchange, 100,000 people were dead and the core of Japan's industry reduced to ashes. The men were silent as they debriefed. No one cheered. The smell of smoke clung to their uniforms even after landing. Historians later called it the beginning of Operation Meetinghouse, the deadliest air raid of the Second World War. But for LeMay, it was just step one. He immediately planned follow-up attacks on Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama, systematically erasing Japan's urban centers. As reports of destruction poured in, even President Roosevelt's advisors expressed unease. Could this still be called conventional warfare? Or had America crossed into something else? An experiment in annihilation? LeMay's defense was brutally simple. Killing Japanese didn't bother me very much, he later said. I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. But we weren't interested in morality. We were interested in ending the war. Those words would haunt him for the rest of his life. The revelation was undeniable. Low-altitude incendiary bombing worked. What technology and precision had failed to accomplish, fire did in a single night. The B-29 crews, once doubted, had turned into the most fearsome weapon of the Pacific. Yet even LeMay admitted privately that something irreversible had been unleashed. After Tokyo, the line between military and civilian targets blurred into smoke. The struggle that began with malfunctioning bombs and missed targets had evolved into a dark science of destruction. The superfortress had finally found its purpose, but in doing so, it redefined the meaning of victory. The world had learned that with enough fuel, enough chemistry, and enough will, a city could be erased without a single soldier setting foot inside it. As dawn rose over Guam that morning, LeMay stood by the runway, cigar clenched in his teeth, eyes fixed on the horizon where the last bombers returned. He didn't smile. He simply muttered to his aide, "It worked." Then he walked away toward headquarters, already planning the next raid. But even as success filled his reports, questions began to burn beneath the statistics. If fire could end a war, what part of our humanity had to burn with it? And as the flames of Tokyo faded into smoke, the world waited for an answer that history still struggles to give. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific sky belonged to America. Japan's once formidable empire was shrinking into smoke and rubble. The B-29 superfortresses, once doubted and ridiculed, now ruled the air like mechanical gods. Their silver wings stretched from horizon to horizon, glinting in the sunlight as they approached the islands in endless, disciplined lines. The firebombing of Tokyo had proven that the United States could devastate Japan without ever landing an army on its soil. General Curtis LeMay had transformed strategy into spectacle, war into pure destruction. And now, the raids came not once a month, but almost nightly. From March to August, the Americans unleashed an inferno on Japan's cities. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, each name became another chapter in the story of annihilation. The B-29s came at low altitude, so low that Japanese civilians could see the white star markings on their fuselages. They flew in streams so dense that witnesses said the sky looked like a highway of silver fish. And below, Japan burned. Each mission followed the same pattern perfected over Tokyo. First, the Pathfinders dropped magnesium flares to light the target area. Then the main formations released their incendiaries in overlapping waves. Wind did the rest. The cities, built mostly from pine wood and paper, were oxygen-rich tinderboxes. Flames spread in rings, feeding on themselves, merging into walls of fire that reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The air inside those infernos became so thin that people suffocated even before the flames touched them. By late May, entire metropolitan regions had been erased. In Yokohama, 40% of the city disappeared in a single night. Kobe's shipyards were obliterated, and the once proud industrial hub of Osaka, where thousands of small workshops produced machine parts and fabrics, was reduced to a plain of white ash. More than 170 square miles of urban Japan ceased to exist. The numbers were incomprehensible, yet the American reports read them like ledger entries. Mission successful. Estimated casualties, 80,000. Enemy industrial output, neutralized. For Japan, these were not numbers, they were ghosts. The imperial government censored news, but word traveled faster than the flames. Refugees carried the horror from city to city. The smell of burned wood and flesh became a permanent feature of the landscape. Fields outside Tokyo filled with blackened survivors, their eyes hollow, their clothes fused to their skin. Priests wandered among them, offering last rites to the dying, but even temples were charred ruins. The raids destroyed not only factories and homes but faith itself. For centuries, Japan had believed the homeland invincible, its islands protected by divine wind, or kamikaze. But this time the wind was American, and it blew fire. Even Emperor Hirohito, who had been shielded from much of the war's brutality, received reports that stunned him into silence. Advisors recalled him staring at a map covered in red ink, representing burned districts. He asked in a trembling voice, "Is there anything left to defend?" The psychological shock reached deep into the Japanese military. The once proud Air Force was shattered. Fighters scrambled to intercept the B-29s, but they were too few, too slow, too outmatched. American planes flew higher, faster, and with radar precision. Japanese pilots, desperate, began to turn themselves into weapons, the kamikaze, crashing into U.S. ships in suicidal waves. Yet even that could not stem the tide. The Americans adapted, armored their ships, improved their radar, and pressed forward. By June, the war had become one-sided slaughter. The B-29s roamed almost unopposed, bombing at will. General LeMay's squadrons began to strike not just industrial cities but smaller towns. Toyama, Fukui, Aomori, each burned to the ground in a matter of hours. The logic was ruthless. If Japan would not surrender, then every place that could produce a bolt or a bullet would vanish. The statistics became a grim measure of dominance. In 90 days, the U.S. Army Air Forces dropped over 40,000 tons of incendiaries on Japan. 16 million people were left homeless. Civil defense was hopeless. Even underground shelters turned into ovens as flames consumed the oxygen. The once bustling capital of Tokyo now resembled a lunar landscape. Survivors described walking through streets so hot that their wooden sandals burst into flame. Entire districts had been reduced to powder. American crews, at first exhilarated by success, grew quieter with each mission. They had begun to understand what they were doing from above. From their altitude, the firestorms looked strangely beautiful. Rivers of molten orange flowing through blackness, swirling patterns like glowing coral reefs. Pilots sometimes radioed each other in awe, not realizing the horror below. When they landed, the sight of melted aircraft paint and warped metal told the truth. The heat rising from those cities had nearly reached them in the sky. Among the few who dared question the campaign was General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces. In private, he asked LeMay whether such destruction was necessary. LeMay's reply was blunt. "If we keep doing this, there won't be anything left for them to fight with. It's not pretty, but it's war." For him, morality was a luxury that soldiers couldn't afford. The Japanese saw it differently. In diaries and letters later recovered, survivors described scenes that defied imagination. One woman wrote that she saw her husband running ahead of her, his clothes on fire, before he vanished into smoke. A schoolteacher described his students, trapped in a playground, huddling together as the asphalt melted beneath them. A Buddhist monk compared the night sky to a storm of red blossoms. He wrote, "We prayed for rain, but the only thing that fell was fire. And yet, Japan did not surrender. Factories relocated underground, soldiers dug tunnels through mountains, and the government told citizens that defeat was impossible. Radio broadcasts urged people to fight to the death with bamboo spears. American analysts were astonished. How could a nation endure this level of devastation and still resist? But they underestimated the power of pride and fear. To surrender, in Japanese culture at that time, meant dishonor worse than death. As the weeks passed, the bombers shifted their focus to destroy what little infrastructure remained. Railways, ports, and supply lines. Every mission deepened Japan's paralysis. American newspapers carried headlines like "Empire of Ashes" and "Cities Die, but War Goes On." Photographs taken by reconnaissance planes looked like black and white sketches of extinction. Streets that once shimmered with lanterns and markets were now nothing but shadows. In July 1945, an American intelligence report estimated that Japan's urban destruction exceeded that of Germany, even before the atomic bomb was dropped. The B-29 campaign had achieved what few believed possible: an entire nation's industrial network reduced to cinders without an invasion. But it came at a moral cost that no one could fully measure. Even some American senators, upon learning of the casualty numbers, wondered aloud whether the difference between us and them is only a matter of who writes history. For LeMay, there was no doubt. He had done what he set out to do: break Japan's capacity to wage war. When journalists later asked if he regretted his methods, he replied, "No. Every soldier wants to shorten the war. Fire just happened to be the tool we had." His crews called him Iron Ass, a nickname both respectful and fearful. They knew he had pushed them to the edge, and that he had been right. By August, Japan's skies were defenseless. The Americans flew in daylight, in formation, unchallenged. It was no longer a question of if Japan would fall, but when. The B-29s, once mocked as useless, had become instruments of terror whose sound alone made cities panic. Mothers clutched children at the faintest rumble of engines. The Japanese government, desperate to maintain morale, forbade the public use of the word defeat. But in the burned silence of its cities, defeat was already everywhere. For those who survived the firebombings, the world had changed forever. They had seen modernity's dark promise fulfilled, the idea that technology could make killing impersonal, industrial, and limitless. For the Americans, it was proof of power unmatched in human history. The slow giants of the sky had turned into executioners of nations. The tables had turned completely. The mockery of the past, the laughter at the lumbering B-29s, was now replaced with awe and terror. Japan's proud cities were no longer fortresses, but targets. The war that had begun with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor now found its reversal. Flames raining from the sky onto the homeland that had once felt untouchable. And yet, even as the ashes cooled, Japan still refused to yield. Its generals promised to fight to the last soldier. LeMay's inferno had broken the cities, but not the spirit. What, then, could finally end this war? As the B-29s returned from their missions, their bomb bays empty, the next weapon was already being prepared. A new kind of fire, one that would burn brighter than anything the world had ever seen. The firestorms had set the stage for something even more terrible. The sky had been America's weapon. Soon, it would become humanity's reckoning. Tokyo lay in ruins. The once living capital, alive with markets, shrines, and laughter, had become a wasteland of soot and twisted wire. Weeks after the March raid, the air still carried a metallic smell. In the mornings, smoke rose from pockets of embers buried beneath the rubble. The Sumida River, once clear, now reflected only gray ash and floating fragments of burned wood. Dogs wandered through the debris, pawing at melted pots. The survivors were silent, moving like shadows through streets where no sound of commerce or song remained. The empire that had sworn it would never fall to outsiders was now a nation of ghosts. Across the Pacific, American intelligence reports spoke in sterile numbers. Target destroyed. Industrial capacity reduced by 51%. Civilian casualties. approximately 100,000. To General Curtis LeMay, those words meant success. He believed he had done what needed to be done to end the war swiftly. Yet even he couldn't escape the images returning pilots described. The glow of entire cities visible from hundreds of miles away, the sight of rivers boiling beneath them. Behind every statistic, a city had vanished, and behind every order, a generation was scarred. But Japan did not surrender. That was the most haunting part. The firebombing, as devastating as it was, failed to break the country's military command. Production continued in underground facilities. The army prepared civilians to resist invasion with bamboo spears. Even after Tokyo, Kobe, Nagoya, and Osaka were leveled, Japan's leaders refused to yield. The Americans had proven they could destroy the cities. What they could not destroy, yet, was the spirit that told every Japanese citizen that surrender was worse than death. In Washington, the mood was shifting. President Roosevelt was gone, and Harry Truman had inherited both the office and the war. His generals assured him that the bombing campaign would soon make an invasion unnecessary. But intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Japan was arming school children, constructing coastal defenses, and showing no signs of capitulation. The Pacific commanders estimated that an invasion of the Japanese mainland, Operation Downfall, could cost over 1 million American lives. And so, the search for a faster end continued. Back in Tokyo, the irony was bitter. For years, Japan had laughed at Americans' slow giants. Those massive bombers too big, too clumsy to hit a moving target. But now, the very machines once mocked had flown unopposed over every major city in the country. The sound of their engines, once dismissed, became a sound that froze blood. People called them baka bakwanki, foolish thunder machines, until they realized the foolishness wasn't in the machines at all. It was in believing that Japan's divine wind would protect them. When survivors of the Tokyo firebombing were interviewed years later, their stories felt almost biblical. A young boy named Fumio remembered clutching his mother's hand as they ran toward the river. The bridge ahead was already burning. People jumped into the water, but the flames floated on the surface because of the oil. "I saw the fish on fire," he said. Another survivor, an old woman named Reiko, recalled how the heat melted glass into puddles. "The street lamps bent like candles," she said. "It was as if the earth itself was dying." Even American airmen began to question what they had done. Lieutenant Robert Weaver, who flew on several raids after Tokyo, wrote in his journal, "We drop the bombs, we see the glow, and we call it victory. But when you can smell the smoke from 200 miles away, you start to wonder what victory even means." That unease grew with every mission. The men knew the purpose, to end the war, but they also knew that something irreversible had been unleashed. By July 1945, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that Japan's urban areas had been effectively neutralized. Out of 60 major cities, 58 were largely destroyed. Tens of millions of people were homeless. The map of Japan looked like a skeleton traced in black and white, its arteries of industry gone. Yet still, there was no surrender. In that vacuum of devastation, the most consequential decision in modern history was made. The same airfields that launched LeMay's B-29s would soon launch another mission, one far deadlier, one that would make Tokyo's inferno seem almost primitive. On August 6, 1945, a bomber named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island, carrying a single weapon that contained more destructive power than all the incendiaries ever dropped over Japan combined. When it reached Hiroshima, the bomb fell silently for 43 seconds before detonating. The explosion erased the city in a white flash hotter than the surface of the sun. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. In those moments, the fire that had once rained from gasoline now came from the atom. The age of conventional firebombing ended where the nuclear age began. General LeMay later reflected, "The atomic bomb had nothing to do with the end of the war, in my opinion. The Japanese were already finished." But others disagreed. To many, the atomic strikes were the final shock that forced Japan's surrender. When Emperor Hirohito finally spoke to his people on August 15th, his voice was calm but hollow. He said, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. It was the first time his subjects had ever heard his voice. In that moment, the empire ended. The divine wind had failed. After the surrender, American survey teams walked through the ruins of Tokyo. They found fragments of pottery fused into the pavement, coins welded together by heat, and skeletons of bicycles standing upright where their riders had fallen. The survivors, now called hibakusha, carried burns that would never heal. In makeshift memorials, people left offerings, rice balls, children's toys, paper cranes, to honor the dead. LeMay returned to America hailed as a hero, yet he remained haunted by his own success. When asked about the morality of burning cities, he gave a characteristically cold answer: "War is immoral. But if you're going to fight, you fight to win." In later years, as head of the U.S. Strategic Air Command, he would design nuclear strike plans that mirrored his own raids on Japan, proof that the lessons of Tokyo had not been forgotten, only scaled upward. For Japan, the rebuilding was slow and painful. With help from American occupation forces, Tokyo began to rise again, this time built of steel and concrete instead of wood and paper. The new city became a symbol of rebirth, but beneath its foundations lay millions of unmarked graves. Generations later, survivors still flinched at the sound of thunder or low-flying planes. The trauma was inherited like language, passed silently from parent to child. The moral reckoning came slowly. Historians argued whether LeMay's campaign was a necessary evil or an unforgivable atrocity. Some said it shortened the war and saved countless American lives that would have been lost in invasion. Others called it state-sanctioned terror, indistinguishable from the crimes it sought to avenge. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. A truth too heavy for any single generation to carry. Yet one irony remains impossible to ignore. The same Japan that had once been reduced to ashes would, within 2 decades, become an industrial power greater than before. Its cities glittered with neon, its factories hummed with prosperity, and its people rebuilt not out of vengeance but endurance. They took the lessons of destruction and turned them into innovation. Tokyo became not a monument to defeat, but to resilience. Still, the memory of that night, the night of March 9, 1945, refuses to fade. Each year, on the anniversary of the firebombing, bells toll in Tokyo's temples, and the names of the dead are read aloud. Survivors speak of the orange sky, the smell of burning tatami, the screams that melted into wind. They do not speak with anger anymore, only with sorrow. One woman said, "When the fire came, we stopped being Japanese or American. We were just human beings running from death." And perhaps that is the moral history keeps returning to, that progress and cruelty often share the same engine, that what one generation calls victory another may call tragedy. The firebombing of Tokyo changed not only a city, but the conscience of mankind. It showed how far humanity could go in the name of ending war, and how easily compassion could be consumed in the process. In one night, more than 100,000 people were killed. More than Nagasaki, more than Dresden. Yet the event remains a footnote in many history books, overshadowed by the mushroom clouds that came after. It was the prelude to the atomic age, the test that proved how fragile civilization truly is. Tokyo's ashes taught the world a lesson that can never be unlearned. That fire, once unleashed, burns everything, including the soul that lit it. If humanity once again forgets that lesson, what city will be next?